What's going on, guys? It's NYPrepper here. In this video, I'm going to talk to you about the major nuclear war targets in the United States so you can better prepare yourself in the worst case scenario of a nuclear war where the United States would be targeted with nuclear weapons by Russia, China, or other nations that have nuclear weapons. So I hope you enjoy this video, and without further delay, let's get started. So in this video, this is part 3 of prepping for nuclear war. If you didn't watch part 1 or part 2, I highly recommend you guys go back and watch part 1 and part 2. It has a lot of background information about how a nuclear war would happen and why. And that's critical to understand before we can get into the details of planning for a nuclear war and prepping for one and naming specific targets. You have to understand the motivations of our enemies and the tactics that they would use. And so if you missed part 1 and part 2, I'll just quickly summarize it before I start listing the main targets. So a nuclear triad is something that I talked about in part 1. And the nuclear triad is basically the main aspects of our nuclear deterrent. Okay, you have land-based, sea-based, and air-based missiles, okay, that we can deploy from any of those platforms. And if there was a nuclear war, any kind of attacking country would go after our nuclear triad. That would be their first goal. Their first goal would be to eliminate our nuclear triad, all right? They're not going to be interested in attacking cities or, economic centers and things like that, because that would not provide them with a major benefit unless it was a total worst case scenario and they felt that they had no choice and they felt that they had to bomb a big city in America in order to get us to stop attacking them, sort of the way that we bombed Hiroshima during World War II to defeat the Japanese. That would be the only time that they would actually bomb a civilian area. But for the most part, their main targets are going to be the nuclear triad and the military infrastructure. All right. So their main goal, they have to eliminate the nuclear triad, because if they don't do that, they can't do anything else. They have to cripple our nuclear arsenal so that we can't counterattack against them. So the way to do that is for them to strike specific targets where we have our nuclear weapons stockpiles and where our nuclear weapons are deployed and associated bases related to our nuclear weapons. After they eliminate the nuclear triad, then they're going to go after critical military targets like naval bases, Air Force bases, Army bases, intelligence collection areas, and radar stations. Okay, that would be the next step. All right. So the first step is they have to eliminate our nuclear arsenal. All right. After they eliminate our nuclear arsenal, then they can move on to military targets. And the goal of an attack on the U.S. would not necessarily be to wipe us out, but it would be to wipe out our nuclear deterrent and wipe out our main military bases, which would basically allow Russia and China to do anything that they wanted around the world, because as things stand right now, Russia and China can't, just invade Japan or invade Australia and conquer Europe. They can't do those things now, because if they tried to, we would respond with nuclear weapons or we would respond with military force. So their main goal of a nuclear attack would be not to wipe out civilians and, destroy America, because that would be a waste of missiles and it wouldn't really help them achieve what they want to achieve. Their main goal would be to eliminate our nuclear deterrent by targeting our nuclear weapons, and then they would also target our military bases, especially the most critical ones, and decapitate our military so that way they could do whatever they wanted without fear of retaliation from the U.S. Because let's be honest, guys, the United States is the only balance of power between, Russia and China. All right, Europe is not powerful enough militarily to balance the equation between East and West. So the U.S. is basically the most critical country that's stopping Russia and China from achieving all of their main goals, which would be, in my opinion, global communism and global domination. They want to create a global communist order where they're in control of everything in the world. And the only way for them to do that is to knock the U.S. off and prevent us from, helping our allies and things like that. So, with getting that out of the way, we can focus on the targets. So first of all, any of these targets that I mentioned, you have to understand that you have the nuclear targets and then you have the non-nuclear targets. The non-nuclear targets would be military targets and other targets of opportunity. And the nuclear targets, like I mentioned, would be the nuclear triad. And those would be the most highest chance that those targets would be struck by missiles, more so than the non-nuclear targets. Okay, the non-nuclear targets would definitely, there's a risk of bombs going off in those areas, but the nuclear targets are the most dangerous to be living around. Okay, so when we talk about targets, I'm going to break it down into like 4 categories. You have major targets, which would be the nuclear triad, and associated anything related to nuclear weapons, whether it's nuclear weapons research or nuclear weapons assembly, things like that. Okay, that falls under the major targets under the nuclear triad. And then you have primary, secondary, and tertiary non-nuclear targets, which would be military bases, nuclear power plants, possibly civilian areas, things like that. Now, I'm not saying that there's no chance at all that we could get hit in civilian areas. It's always a possibility, so I don't want to rule that out. But I think the most likely scenario is that they would mainly go after military targets and try to eliminate our nuclear deterrent, which would allow them to expand their territory. And we would be too busy cleaning up the rubble after the bombs to stop them, and, also if they strike specific targets like radar facilities, command and control, and communications bases and assets, then it would pretty much reduce our ability to wage war against them and help our allies. So that's something to consider. Now, they could, if they were to go after civilian targets, obviously it would be, big cities like New York City or Washington, D.C. is an obvious one. Los Angeles, Chicago, big cities like that would definitely be a target. But I just don't see them doing that because it doesn't serve them any purpose. And on top of that, it will make them look like the bad guys because, they would be killing innocent civilians. So at that point, people around the world are going to definitely see them as the aggressors. Versus if they only go after our nukes or they go after our military hardware, then they could claim that they were defending themselves against a American attack that was coming, and they had no choice but to take preemptive action against us and take out our nukes, But if they start bombing cities, that's going to be a lot harder for them to claim self-defense in the world stage, On top of that, when you bomb cities, what that does is that creates it opens a can of worms for any country when you do something like that, because now it's not just, okay, you bombed our military bases or you took out some of our nukes. All right, now you're talking about you killed, millions of American citizens. And what that's going to do is that's going to solidify very strong, anti-Chinese or anti-Russian sentiment in the United States and around the world. And, it's going to really create a sleeping giant that could cause a problem later on down the line for China or Russia, which they would not want to do. So they wouldn't want to deal with that. Also, if they wipe out our cities, that's worse for them too, because there's less economic resources that they can draw from us if they were to try to, subdue us into a global communist order where they're the ones in control and we are just slaves for them and working for them. If they wipe out our cities, then that's going to make it harder. It's going to eliminate the economic production out of those cities. So I don't think they would want to do that. Okay. I just don't think they would do that unless it was a situation where they felt that, kind of like how we bombed Hiroshima, it was kind of a last resort, where we felt like we had to do that because the Japanese were really getting crazy and they were killing a lot of our troops and things like that. That would be the only scenario. Now, North Korea could potentially target civilian populations. They would be more likely to do that. But we're not talking about North Korea here. Here we're talking about superpowers, battling it out and the struggle for power and world domination, which, we know that China and Russia, they lost the Cold War. So now they want to win something. They haven't won anything yet. So, they always wanted a global communist order. You definitely, the targets that I'm going to mention in this video, you definitely don't want to be anywhere within 30 miles of these targets. And the reason why is because these targets are going to sustain massive attacks by nuclear missiles and nuclear warheads. There's going to be potentially hundreds of nuclear warheads launched at these locations. So you don't want to be anywhere within 30 miles because, number one, the blast and the overpressure. Number two, the thermal radiation, the ionizing radiation, rubble from falling buildings. And, finally would be fallout radiation as well. All right. And fallout radiation is a little more tricky because you could remove yourself from the immediate area of a nuclear target. Let's say, for example, you're outside of that 30-mile zone, and you feel that you're far enough away from that target, but nuclear fallout can travel hundreds of miles, and some of these targets are going to be hit with hundreds of nukes, and I'll explain that in a second. They're going to be hit with hundreds of nukes, okay? And the amount of fallout that's going to create, even if you're not near the blast zone and you don't have to worry about overpressure, thermal radiation, rubble, and, the ionizing radiation from the immediate blast, you're going to have to worry about fallout, even if you're 500 miles away from the blast point, okay? So that's something that I'm going to talk about in later videos. I'm going to talk about fallout protection and how to make bomb shelters and things like that, and understanding basic nuclear survival principles. That, it's nothing really too complicated, but it's something that you need to know as a prepper. So I'm going to talk about that in the next parts of this series, but in this part, I'm going to focus on the targets, like I mentioned. And so you definitely want to be nowhere near 30 miles from any of these targets. So if you're a prepper and you're looking to buy a bug out location, maybe buy some property in another state that you feel is safer, or you're looking to relocate, all right? Or if you currently live in somewhere close to one of these targets, you need to really think about some plans that you would need to have. Obviously, if you're looking to buy a bug out location, or if you're looking to relocate, you want to avoid relocating or buying property anywhere within 30 miles of these targets. And not just within 30 miles, but you also want to avoid being downwind of these targets, okay? Because again, like I mentioned, nuclear fallout can travel hundreds of miles. So if you're downwind, you could be 200 or 300 miles away from the detonation point, and the fallout is going to go to your direction because of the prevailing winds, So you need to, when you're buying bug out locations or you're looking to relocate, you need to really do your research on prevailing winds and, where you are in relation to the nearest major nuclear target. So this way you don't get hit by that fallout cloud, or if you do get hit, you're far enough away, or you're not kind of directly in the path of the fallout cloud, which will be pushed by prevailing winds. Okay. And I'll do a video on prevailing winds around the United States, but you need to be familiar with prevailing winds, particularly if you live close to one of these major nuclear targets. Now, these major nuclear targets I'm about to show you guys, these are the ones that are going to get hit with the most nukes, okay? These are the ones that you don't want to be anywhere near. Like I said, 30 miles away, and you don't want to be within the downwind. You don't want to be downwind of these targets because the fallout is going to be monstrous. But that being said, there are primary targets, nuclear targets in every single state. So even if you're not near one of these major targets that I'm about to mention, there are primary nuclear targets in every single state. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to upload those targets onto my website, www.NYPrepper.com. And I'm going to upload those targets so you could see where the main targets are in your state. There's a primary nuclear target in every single state. All right, so if you remember, I categorized nuclear and non-nuclear targets, and the nuclear targets are legs of our nuclear triad, which are the most likely, and the targets that are going to get hit with the most nukes and are most likely to get hit, okay? But then you also have non-nuclear targets, which would be military infrastructure and peripheral bases and intelligence agencies, things like that are critical to the functioning of our military. Those are going to be targeted as well, only if the nuclear triad is hit first. Okay, so they have to eliminate the nuclear triad first before they can start attacking our military infrastructure, like I mentioned. All right, so those primary targets are in every state, and you're going to want to locate yourself away from those primary targets as well, in addition to the major targets, okay? So, without further delay, I want to just show you guys these targets here. Now, another thing that Russia and China could do is that they could also use neutron bombs and cobalt bombs to contaminate our food supply and poison water supplies. But again, that's less likely. I know somebody would probably mention that, so I figured I would mention that. But I don't think that's likely because they don't care about doing that. They want to achieve territorial expansion, and they want to achieve a global communist order. And in order for them to do that, they need to eliminate our nuclear deterrent and decapitate our military, take out our main military communications and command and control infrastructure, so our military can't operate and wage war against them while they're expanding their territory around the world. It could also be a precursor to an invasion as well. They could potentially invade us, although I don't know how likely that would be, just because the U.S. is such a large landmass and it would be hard for them to control. And you have, a lot of gun owners in this country and a huge terrain. It would be hard for them to control the U.S. They could invade the U.S. and maybe take a few cities and control some of the big cities. But outside of the big cities, they're going to have a hard time controlling, every single small town and every single rural area, even like we've seen in movies like Red Dawn, where they controlled the major cities they had under their control, but the rural areas they didn't have under control. And, American guerrillas were, resisting. So an invasion is not necessarily their goal. Okay, their goal is to eliminate our nuclear deterrent. All right, but it's always a possibility. Another thing too is they could hit us with an EMP before they launch the nukes. Okay, so that would be something to think about as well. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you the targets now. And what you see here are the main nuclear targets that you need to concern yourself with and avoid. Okay. Sorry, it's not the most polished video here, but I'm trying to do this with limited time. I wanted to get this out to you guys. So all these marks that you see here on the map, all of these are major nuclear targets. Okay. You do not want to be anywhere close to these areas here, okay? All of these marks here on the map, these pin drops, these are all components of our nuclear deterrent and our nuclear triad, okay? Now, that being said, I could list probably another 50 targets that would likely also be targeted, right? I know some people are going to start naming things in the comments. They're going to say, well, what about this base? And what about that base? I could do that, but it would take me days to sit here and, list all, the bases. But, you have places like, for example, Vandenburg Air Force Base or Dugway Proving Grounds, Area 51, Norfolk Naval Base, a lot of the bases around D.C. like Fort Meade. Of course, those are going to also be targeted, but primarily these are the main targets that Russia or China would go after because these are critical to our nuclear triad and our nuclear deterrent, okay? So if you remember what the nuclear triad was, it was land, sea, and air-based missiles, all right? And so the biggest targets are going to be Minot Air Force Base, Malmstrom Air Force Base, and Warren Air Force Base. Okay, these three bases here have about 70% of our nuclear weapons, all right, that are ready to deploy at a moment's notice. All right, these three bases here contain all of our Minuteman ICBMs, okay, which were previously peacekeepers. All right, the Minuteman ICBMs are our main land-based nuclear weapons, okay? And they're all stored in these three bases here, all right? These bases have hundreds of nuclear silos in them, okay? Hundreds. Each one of these bases, Malmstrom, Minot, and Warren, they have hundreds of nuclear silos spread out outside of the bases, okay, in the surrounding areas. So it's not the base itself that's going to be targeted. There's nuclear silos that are spread out, outside of the base, potentially up to 10 to 20 miles from where the center of the base is. There's going to be silos that are spread out around the base. And if you zoom in, if you really want to see, you could zoom into one of these bases here like Malmstrom, and you could zoom in, and on the outskirts of the base, you'll see little, marks on the ground that you can see through the satellite that there's some kind of missile silos there, okay? So each one of these bases have hundreds of nuclear silos. A silo is just a tube underground, and the tube is where the nuclear missile is stored and launched from. So China and Russia would have to target these three bases. This would be their first volley of missiles would go towards these three bases right here, and they would target the silos, okay? And they would have to hit those bases with hundreds of missiles in order to neutralize all of the weapons and the silos that are located in these bases. All right, now they're not going to be able to neutralize all of them, but if they get 60 to 70%, that's going to really make a huge difference, and that's really all they need. All right, but they're going to launch a huge volley of missiles, and those huge volley of missiles is going to be targeted at these three bases right here. All right, and so you definitely don't want to be located anywhere within at least 30 miles of these areas here. And again, we're talking about, because there's so many silos there. All right, there's hundreds of silos in each one of these bases, so they need to get a direct hit on each one of those silos in order to destroy the silos, so that way we can't launch a nuke back at them. Okay, so they're going to have to use smaller nukes. Okay, they're not going to use giant nukes like in Hiroshima, but they're going to use smaller nukes that are just going to be powerful enough to destroy the silos that are in these three bases here. Okay, so they're going to have to use hundreds of smaller nukes, and even though they're smaller, the fact that there's hundreds of them is going to create a massive amount of radiation and fallout. The blast wave from all these bombs going off is going to shake the ground. I mean, just imagine like hundreds of nukes going off, 10 miles away from where you are. I mean, it's going to cause earthquakes. Okay, it could potentially cause bridges to collapse from the vibration, even as far as 50 miles away, because you're going to have, hundreds of nukes going off in these bases here. And so you don't want to be anywhere near these areas. And, even just the vibration can cause buildings to collapse and, almost create like an earthquake type situation. And so the fallout clouds are going to be absolutely massive from these three bases here when these are hit by a nukes. And they're going to spread pretty far away. So you don't want to be downwind from these bases here. Okay. Now, that being said, this is not the main target. There's also, so that's the land-based portion of our nuclear triad. The next thing that they would go after is our submarine launched ballistic missiles, which currently are located in only two places across the U.S. because of the START treaty that Obama and Clinton were big fans of with Russia. We created a treaty with Russia that said that we would only position our submarines, our nuclear submarines would only be based in two bases in the U.S. Okay, and those bases are Bangor in Washington and Kings Bay in Georgia. All right, these two bases have most of our submarine launched ballistic missiles, which represents the sea-based portion of our triad. All right, in particular, the Bangor base in Washington has about 2,000 Trident missiles. Okay, the Bangor base in Washington has about 2,000 Trident missiles here. Okay, so if you're in the Seattle area, you're in a really bad situation, because this base right here will sustain massive hits from nuclear weapons. Okay, so you need to have a bug out plan, and ideally you want to be located at least 30 miles away and upwind from this base right here, if possible. Okay, it's not going to be realistic to try to evacuate when the missiles are flying, because at that point everybody's going to try to evacuate. So and missiles can cross the ocean in 30 minutes or less. So even by the time you realize that there's missiles coming, let's say you get an alert on your phone, by the time you actually start running out the door and get in your car, how far can you really travel, depending on traffic, depending on, if you're in a city or if you're close to a highway and you can get quickly on the highway and get out. So, you don't want to be anywhere near this base here, okay? And you don't want to be downwind from it either when the bombs go off. So the Bangor base has about 2,000 Trident missiles there. And they also have a significant portion of our Ohio-class subs, which are the submarines that launch ballistic missiles, all right? So that's a major target. Kings Bay, Georgia also has a lot of submarine-launched ballistic missiles, Trident missiles, and Ohio-class subs. So that's going to be hit, okay? You don't want to be near that. Then you also have the air-based portion, which is the B-2 bombers and the B-52s, and also the B-1 Lancers, which are less likely to be used unless that's more of a last resort plane that they would use. Primarily the B-2s and the B-52s would be the primary air portion of our triad. And the B-2s are mostly stored in Whiteman Air Force Base. Okay, Whiteman Air Force Base, Missouri. That's where pretty much all of our B-2 bombers are located. Now, there are B-2 bombers spread out across the world in different areas, and they're constantly moving them around from different bases. But primarily, Whiteman Air Force Base is probably going to have at least 50% of our B-2 bombers located there. Okay, so that's a major target. Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana is a headquarters for Air Force Global Strike Command. All right, Air Force Global Strike Command is that's the Air Force's command and control for nuclear war. Okay, so if there was a situation where the Air Force had to launch B-2s into the air and use B-2s to wage nuclear war, Barksdale Air Force Base is the command and control headquarters for that. Okay, so this would be a huge target as well. Okay, but primarily the largest targets, in my opinion, because you guys have to remember that the B-2 bombers and the air-based portion of our nuclear triad is very small when you compare it to the ground-based portion and the sea-based portion. Okay, so 70% of our nukes are located between Minot, Malmstrom, and Warren Air Force bases. Okay, this is where most of our nukes are. And then after that, Bangor in Washington. And then after that, you're going to have Kings Bay and Whiteman. All right. But these four bases here, Bangor, Malmstrom, Minot, and Warren, are going to be the highest ranking targets for Russia and China, because if they eliminate these four bases here, that's going to take out 60 to 70% of our nuclear arsenal. Okay, so they don't even have to worry about the B-2s at that point, because there's only 20 B-2s in our fleet. Okay, 20 B-2s is not going to really do a lot of damage to China and Russia. They could fly and drop a nuke over, Beijing or Moscow, but 20 nukes is not going to really do anything. All right, 20 planes. All right. And then if they target other command and control like Barksdale Air Force Base, that's going to totally eliminate the ability of the B-2s to even operate. Okay. Now, some other targets that we need to consider too is communications. Okay. Communications, critical one is North American Aerospace Defense, NORAD, okay, underneath Cheyenne Mountain in Colorado Springs. This is a major communications hub. All right, this is the brain of our nuclear and our nuclear command and our radars. All the information from radars and satellites is all fed into NORAD. And they have people that work around the clock analyzing the data from the radars and the satellites, looking for anything that would be dangerous. Okay, so this is a major command and control, radar, and communications area that would be targeted. Another one is Offutt Air Force Base, which is in Omaha, Nebraska. This is the home of Strategic Command. Okay, this is what's considered the doomsday command of the military. Okay, if there was an apocalypse or a nuclear war or a worst case scenario, alien invasion, Offutt Air Force Base is where the president or the Defense Department, they could run the entire military from Offutt Air Force Base. Okay, this is Dick Cheney was actually sent here after 9/11. They moved Dick Cheney to Offutt Air Force Base just in case something were to happen to the president and Dick Cheney would have to take over. He could run the entire military from this base right here. So this would be a big target as well. Some other targets would be the Pantex plant in North Texas here. in the Panhandle. Okay, the Pantex plant is the only area in the entire United States where nuclear weapons can be assembled. Okay, so the Pantex plant is critical for assembling nuclear weapons and putting them on top of ICBMs and actually building missiles. Okay, that's a critical target for China and Russia, because if they wipe out the Pantex plant, it's going to eliminate our ability to build more nukes that we have in stockpile. Because remember, guys, just because if China and Russia were to hit these bases here, Minot, Malmstrom, and Warren, doesn't mean that those are the areas where all of our nukes are. Okay, our nukes are spread across the country in different bases, but they're disassembled. Okay, so what happens is our nukes are spread out, but they're not ready to be deployed. So they have to go to the Pantex plant, and they have to be either assembled or disassembled. And once they're assembled, then they can go from the Pantex plant to Bangor or to Malmstrom or to Whiteman or Minot, but the Pantex plant is where they actually put the missiles together, because it's too dangerous for us to store 10,000 nukes that have live warheads on them. All right, it's too dangerous to store them in that condition. It's like storing loaded guns around your house with kids. It's just dangerous. So we store our weapons unassembled. And what happens is, if there was a need to build more nukes, and if, let's say, these nukes we have in these bases here is not enough, then we would have to start assembling them here, okay, and resupply our nuclear forces in Bangor or these other bases here, okay? So the Pantex plant would be a huge target. And then you also have Idaho National Labs, Los Alamos National Labs, Sandia National Labs, and Lawrence Livermore National Labs. All of these labs are critical for nuclear weapons development and research. So these would also be major targets as well, okay? So, that's pretty much it for this video. So I'm going to upload the list of primary targets to my website. I'll put a link in the description box down below. And I hope you learned something from this video. I hope it helps you prep. You definitely don't want to be located anywhere near any of these bases here, okay, if possible. So, and again, the chances of a nuclear war right now, they're not that high. And it sounds very, unusual that somebody would be talking about it. But you never know what could happen 5 or 10 years from now. China is continuously building their nuclear arsenal. Russia is continuously building their nuclear arsenal. They just created a new weapon called the Status 6, which is a underwater torpedo, okay, that can carry 100 megaton nuclear warhead that would, totally go unnoticed and can bomb any one of our coastal cities without being intercepted. So, as time goes on, it's more likely that there could be a nuclear war. And if you're a Christian, the Bible has a lot of, hints about a nuclear war of some kind in the end times. So that's pretty much it, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video. And as always, take care. God bless. And don't forget the 3 Ps: prepare, practice, and persevere.